Next seam finish is a flat felled seam. A flat felled seam is the most common, or the most common place that you would have seen flat felled seams is probably on your jeans. That double top stitch seam that you will see on one side, either the inseam or the outseam of your jeans. It is done by first stitching the wrong sides together. And so if you look at denim is a twill weave, and so you will see that you need to take the wrong sides and stitch the wrong side together. And then it is sewn at 5/8 of an inch. So you will have sewn that 5/8 of an inch. And then you will press it flat as it was sewn to set the stitch. Then you will press the seam open. Okay. And then the seam that is going towards the back, you are going to trim. And so I actually took a ruler and just measured with that 1/4 inch and drew myself a line to trim that on so that I could trim it quite quickly while you were watching and not have to take a lot of time measuring while you were watching. So you trim that off, and now you have one long seam allowance and one that's still the full 5/8 of an inch and one that has been trimmed down. The side that hasn't been trimmed, you now press it under 1/4 of an inch. And so you'll take your hem gauge, mark it to 1/4 of an inch, and press that under 1/4 of an inch all the way up. And just like the turn and stitch seam allowance, if you turn it under 1/4 of an inch, that means that from the edge of your seam to the actual seam line, you should have 3/8 of an inch left. And so press it under, check and make sure that you are even from this folded edge to your seam allowance, or to your stitch seam, at 3/8 of an inch. As if you're smooth and even, then with this edge pressed under, which I have done ahead of time, so that's pressed under and pressed in place, I am now going to take this folded edge and fold it back over the top of the one that was cut off. Okay? And so you can see that first row of stitching that was sewn there. And then this is going to press flat. Now I am not using a press cloth because I want you to be able to see what's going on, but you would use a press cloth because you are pressing on the right side of your fabric. And so you want, in order not to damage your fabric, you would be certain that you would use a press cloth. Now, a common mistake that people will make when they are doing a flat filled seam is they forget that this first row of stitching that was sewn, the first row of stitching that was sewn actually shows on the right side when you're through. And so they'll be a little bit careless and sew that and then not realize it's actually going to show on the right side. So you press that over, and then I actually like to turn this over and check the back side and make sure that as I pressed this, I didn't wind up with a bubble or pull that seam over and wind up that on the inside there would be a tuck, and it actually changes the size of your clothes. And so I like to take and now press from the inside also and make sure that that seam stayed pressed and defined where that first 5/8 was actually stitched in place there. And so when that's done and you're ready to go, you can go back again with your hem gauge and check on the right side, making sure that from that folded edge you are 3/8 of an inch to your stitching line. And I stitched this with blue, that first row with blue, so that you could see it quite easily as we're measuring the second time through here. And so you get that first row of stitching that shows there. When you're good with that, on your little sample, on a short little piece, you may not need to pin it, but if you're doing a full seam allowance, you would absolutely pin this in place, because your presser foot is going to tend to push the fabric as it sews, and you are going to wind up with it kind of barber poling or pushing a little bit on a bias if you are not careful. And so put some pins in that you will take out as you get to them. And then when you're ready, we will come and edge stitch that edge, and it will be then we'll be through with this seam allowance, or with this seam finish. So you are going to edge stitch along this folded edge to complete this flat felled seam. Again, you can use your number 5 foot or number 10 foot. Number 10 is the edge stitching foot to sew this edge. I'm just going to use the regular foot and edge stitch down it. If the seam is going to wind up in a hem, then you can back stitch at the top or the bottom of it, and then you are just going to edge stitch up that side. And ideally you should stay the same distance from that first row of stitching as you edge stitch down the side there, because you want them to wind up being about the same space apart, top to bottom. They will look a little funny weaving in and out from each other if you don't stay fairly straight. And I chose another thread again that's going to stick out and show quite a bit, so you'll be able to see this when it's done. And so you can see that second row of stitching. The first row is a little bit darker blue and the second row is a little bit lighter blue, but you can see that there are 2 rows of stitching. So on a flat felled seam on the outside or on the right side, you get 2 rows of stitching that show. On the inside, you will have 1 row of stitching that shows.